This isn't a story about one country. It could happen anywhere. It happens in quiet houses, after long marriages, when no one is watching. People think love ends with big arguments or a dramatic betrayal. But most of the time, love just fades away quietly. It gets lost in routines, in silence, in two people sitting in the same room but living completely separate lives. They were married for 25 years. And then, one day, they realized they had stopped truly seeing each other. Not because they wanted to, but simply because they were tired. That was the night everything began to change. This is a story about a marriage that almost ended without a fight. Listen carefully, because this story isn't really just about them. It might be about you. Subscribe to hear the rest of the story. Min-soo's mornings always began the same way. The alarm rang at 6:30, not because he needed it. His body woke up on its own now. He washed his face, stared at his reflection in the mirror, and wondered when the man looking back started to feel like a stranger. The wrinkles around his eyes weren't just from age. They were faint maps of silent worries and unspoken regrets. In the kitchen, Jian was already awake. She moved quietly through the morning light, her movements practiced and almost invisible. Too quietly, the soft hiss of boiling water, the gentle clink of a spoon against a ceramic cup. These were the only sounds that punctuated the heavy silence between them. They didn't look at each other, not because they were angry, but because it had become unnecessary. Like an old habit you forget you even have. "Dinner's ready," she'd say in the evening. Her voice was always calm, too calm. It held no warmth, no expectation, just a statement of fact. "Okay," he would reply. That was always his answer. A single word that closed the door to any further conversation. They sat at the same dining table, facing the same direction, watching the same television news report. But somehow, they were never together. Their bodies were just inches apart, but their minds were miles away, each lost in their own separate world. Min-soo chewed his food without tasting it, his thoughts drifting back to deadlines and meetings, anything to fill the void. Jian watched the screen without seeing it, the bright colors blurring into a meaningless pattern. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It filled the space where words and laughter used to live. There was a time, long ago, when dinner meant something more. It meant laughter echoing off the walls. It meant playful arguments about which show to watch or whose turn it was to do the dishes. Back then, silence between them meant comfort, a shared peace that needed no words. But those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life now, a faded photograph from a past he could no longer connect with. On his daily commute to work, Min-soo often found himself staring out the window, asking the same question over and over again. When did we stop talking? He could never pinpoint the exact moment. It wasn't a loud, dramatic event. It faded, slowly, quietly, like a single light bulb left on in an empty room. Its glow getting dimmer and dimmer until one day, it just goes out. Jian spent her afternoons in a house that was impeccably clean but no longer felt like a home. It was just a structure of walls and furniture. Their child's room, once a whirlwind of joyful chaos, was now perfectly organized. Too neat. No stray toys on the floor. No mountain of laundry waiting to be washed. No noise. No reason to even knock on the door anymore. Sometimes, she would stand in the middle of that silent room, holding an old worn-out sweater that still faintly smelled of her son, and she would wonder, was this sterile quiet really what I worked so hard for all these years? She wasn't unhappy, not in the way people cry or scream, but she wasn't truly alive either. She was just existing, floating through the days in a state of muted gray. Then, one ordinary afternoon, her phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. A message from a name she barely recognized, a colleague from a part-time job she'd recently taken. "You looked tired today." She stared at the screen for a long time, longer than she should have. There were no hearts, no playful emojis, no hidden promises. It was just a simple observation, just concern. And that simple act of someone noticing her was something she hadn't received in a very, very long time. It felt like a drop of rain on parched earth. A few days later, another message followed. "Have you eaten?" Jian found herself smiling without even realizing it. A small, involuntary curve of her lips, and then, just as quickly, she stopped smiling, because that tiny moment of warmth, that small smile, felt dangerous. It felt like a betrayal. That night, lying in bed next to Min-soo, she faced the ceiling, the darkness of the room feeling less empty than the space between them. His breathing was steady, even peaceful. He was asleep, oblivious. She wondered if he ever felt lonely too. Did he lie awake at night, staring into the dark, feeling the same hollow ache in his chest? She wanted to ask. The words were right there, on the tip of her tongue. Just a simple question. Are you lonely? But instead, she held them back, turned away from him, and pulled the covers a little tighter around herself. And in that small, silent movement, something invisible between them cracked. She didn't know it yet. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning. The beginning of a choice that would change everything. A path that would lead them somewhere they never intended to go. Sometimes, the end of love doesn't begin with a loud, dramatic betrayal. It begins quietly, with being ignored, with feeling unseen. And neither of them realized just how close they were to crossing a line. A fragile boundary that once broken, could never be erased. The man wasn't extraordinary. He didn't have a flashy car or wear expensive suits. He didn't speak with dramatic flair or make grand promises. But when Ji-yeon spoke, he listened. He didn't glance at his phone. His eyes didn't wander to a TV screen across the room. He listened with an intensity that made her feel like her words were the most important thing in the world at that moment. At first, their conversations were simple, almost mundane. They talked about the unpredictable weather, the small frustrations of work, the little inconveniences that fill up a day. These were safe topics, the kind of small talk you make with a friendly acquaintance. Gi-yeon assured herself it was harmless. Just a bit of conversation, a dose of kindness from a stranger. But she was forgetting a simple truth. For someone who has been starving for affection, a small act of kindness can feel exactly like love. One afternoon, she found herself staring at her phone, her heart jumping slightly with anticipation, waiting for it to vibrate with a message from him. That small moment of realization sent a jolt of fear through her. She quickly placed the phone face down on the table, as if to hide her own feelings from herself. She walked away, trying to push the thought out of her mind. But forgetting requires conscious effort. And the very fact that she had to try so hard meant that something significant had already taken root in her heart. On a drizzly evening, their paths crossed again. She told herself it was a coincidence, a chance encounter. But deep down, a part of her wondered if she had subconsciously willed it to happen. They stood under the shelter of a single small umbrella, the rain falling in a steady rhythm all around them. The space between them was tiny, yet they were careful not to touch. The sound of the rain was loud, a constant drumming on the fabric above, but in the small bubble they occupied, everything felt profoundly quiet. I should probably get going, she said, her voice barely a whisper, almost lost in the sound of the storm. He simply nodded, in agreement, but neither of them made a move to leave. In that suspended moment, Ji-yeon felt a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. She felt seen, not as Min-soo's wife, not as her children's mother, but simply as Ji-yeon, the woman she was before those roles defined her. The feeling was intoxicating, but it lasted only for a few seconds before a wave of guilt washed over her, cold and immediate. When she finally arrived home, the house was dark. Min-soo was sitting alone in the living room, bathed in the silent, flickering light of the muted television. "You're late," he said. His voice wasn't angry or accusatory, it was just empty. The words "I met someone" were on the tip of her tongue, a confession waiting to spill out, but she swallowed them down. The traffic was terrible because of the rain. She lied instead. He nodded once, and that was the end of the conversation. That night, as they lay in bed, Min-soo stared up at the dark ceiling. He couldn't put his finger on it, but an unsettling feeling had taken hold of him. Something was wrong. Gi-yeon lay beside him, her back turned to him, her breathing too steady for someone who was truly asleep. She was awake, lost in her own thoughts. The physical space between them on the mattress was small, but the emotional distance felt vast, like an ocean stretching out in the darkness. The days that followed fell into a new, dangerous rhythm. The messages from the other man continued. They were never explicit, never crossed a physical line. They were just words, but each word was like a thread, gently pulling her a little further away from her life, from her husband. Min-soo started to notice small changes. He heard her laugh again, a genuine, light-hearted sound he hadn't heard in so long. But the laughter was never for him. It was always directed at the small screen in her hand. He began to ask himself the questions he had been avoiding for years, the questions that were too painful to confront. When was the last time I truly asked her how her day was, and actually listened to the answer? When did I stop trying to make her smile? When did I stop seeing her as the woman I fell in love with? But asking questions in the silence of his own mind could unchange the reality that was unfolding around him. The answers were already there. in the growing distance between them. One night, mustering all his courage, he broke the heavy silence that had become their new normal. He turned to her, in the dim light of the bedroom, and asked a simple question. "Are you happy?" Jian froze, her body tensing as if she'd been struck. The question wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, gentle, and that's what made it so devastating. She couldn't bring herself to answer. She couldn't lie, but she couldn't speak the truth either. Her silence was the only answer he needed. And in that shared, suffocating silence, they both knew a line had been crossed. Something had been broken. Sometimes, the greatest betrayals don't begin with a physical touch or a secret rendezvous. They begin much more quietly. They begin in the heart, when you start to confide in someone else, when another person's attention becomes the place you go to feel safe, to feel seen, to rest your weary heart. And as they lay there, separated by a silence more profound than any argument, neither of them could possibly imagine the depth of the pain that this quiet truth was about to unleash upon their lives. The truth revealed itself without any planning. It was a Tuesday evening, just like any other. Rain tapped gently against the window, a soft rhythm in the quiet house. Minsu was reading in the living room when his wife Jian's phone, left forgotten on the coffee table, suddenly lit up the dim space. A single message glowed on the screen. "I miss you today." Minsu didn't move. He felt the air leave his lungs, as if he'd been punched. His first instinct was a hot flash of anger, a surge of betrayal that tightened his jaw. His second was a cold, creeping fear, the kind that makes your stomach drop. But what followed was something else entirely, something he hadn't expected. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion. It felt like the weight of years of unspoken words, of growing distance, of pretending everything was fine, had just crashed down on him, all because of that one sentence. When Ji Young came back into the room, a glass of water in her hand, she saw him staring at the phone. She knew immediately. The color drained from her face, and her expression held a story of guilt and sorrow before she even opened her mouth. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Minsu finally broke it, his voice barely a whisper, hoarse with a pain he hadn't realized was there. "Was I really that invisible to you?" The question seemed to shatter the last of her composure. Her shoulders began to shake, and she slowly sank onto the sofa opposite him, placing the glass down with a trembling hand. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she choked out, tears starting to stream down her face. I just didn't want to feel so alone anymore." For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Minsu truly listened. He didn't think about his own hurt, his own anger. He didn't prepare a defense or an argument. He just listened to the raw loneliness in her voice. And in that moment of pure, unfiltered honesty, a painful realization dawned on him. He had stopped being a husband long before she had sought comfort elsewhere. He had been present in the house, but absent in their life together. The daily check-ins had become routine. The shared meals, silent. The "how was your day?" a question asked without waiting for an answer. He had built the walls of their silence brick by brick, and now he was shocked to find someone had looked for a way out. That night, they talked until the first light of dawn began to peek through the curtains. For the first time in years, they didn't just speak. They communicated. They unpacked years of disappointment, of quiet resentment, of missed chances and anniversaries forgotten. They talked about how love doesn't just vanish into thin air. It doesn't explode. It gets neglected. It withers slowly from lack of attention, like a plant left in a dark corner without water. There were tears, yes, and there was anger, sharp and cutting at times. But beneath it all, there was a layer of honesty they hadn't touched in over a decade. They laid their feelings bare, a messy and painful collection of everything they had hidden from each other. Finally, as the sky turned from gray to a soft pink, the question that no one ever wants to ask hung in the air between them. Should we end this? The word divorce felt alien, a heavy, final sound in the room where they had built their life. They tried to imagine it. Separate lives, waking up in different homes, empty mornings without the familiar, if silent, presence of the other. For Minsu, it meant freedom from this quiet tension, but also a crushing loneliness. For Ji and I, it was an escape from feeling unseen, but also the terror of starting over. Minsu was the first to speak again, his voice weary but clear. "I don't know how to fix this." It wasn't an accusation. It was a confession of helplessness. Jianan looked up, her eyes red and swollen, and nodded. "I don't know either." A long pause followed. Then, Minsu added something unexpected, something that came from a place deeper than his pride. But I know I don't want to run away anymore. She looked at him then, really looked at him, not as the distant man who shared her home, but as the man she had once fallen in love with. She saw the lines of regret etched around his eyes, the vulnerability he hadn't shown in years. "Can we start again?" he asked. It wasn't a demand or a promise. It was a fragile request, a plea for a chance he wasn't sure he deserved. Guion didn't answer right away. She understood that forgiveness isn't a switch you flip. It's not a single moment of absolution. It's a conscious decision, a path you choose to walk every single day. The path of healing would be long and filled with difficult moments. Could she do it? Could they rebuild from the ruins? Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. She nodded. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no grand declarations or magical resolutions. It was something far more real, and perhaps more meaningful. It was the beginning of a difficult journey. They chose effort over escape. They chose the hard work of rebuilding trust over the easy path of walking away. And that single, quiet choice, made in the dim light of a new day, changed everything. Some relationships end with a loud, dramatic crash, but others, the ones that endure, sometimes survive quietly through the pain of brutal honesty, the humility of admitting fault, and the incredible courage it takes to stay and try again. Not every love story ends with happiness. Some end with understanding. Others survive because two people decide to stay even when it would be easier to leave. This story doesn't offer a perfect answer, only a quiet question. If you've been living next to someone for years, have you truly been with them? Have you noticed when they grew tired, or lonely, or silent, and one day, you realized just how far apart you've become? If there's someone sitting beside you tonight, maybe you don't need big words, just one honest sentence. You've worked hard all this time, and if no one is there, remember this: it's never too late to understand what love really is. Thanks for listening. Please look forward to the next episode.